The fastest way to embarrass yourself is to underestimate the quiet person in the room. I did not know it then, but those words would follow me through one of the strangest weeks of my life. The laughter started before I even sat down. Not loud laughter. The kind people think you cannot hear. The kind that travels across a room disguised as conversation. I stepped through the doors of Hall Alpha carrying a notebook, a travel mug, and a duffel bag that had seen better days. Around me stood nearly 60 participants selected for one of the most respected military leadership programs in the country. Officers, analysts, tactical planners, people with impressive resumes and even more impressive confidence. The facility sat high in the Colorado mountains, nearly 7,000 feet above sea level. Snow covered the distant peaks beyond the windows. The air outside was sharp and cold. Inside, the room felt even colder. I could feel eyes following me as I searched for my assigned seat. "You have got to be kidding me," someone muttered behind me. "They brought a civilian?" Another voice answered. "Maybe she is somebody's guest." A few chuckles followed. I kept walking. Experience had taught me something useful. People often reveal more about themselves than they realize when they think you do not matter. My name tag rested on the table. Rachel Walker. Nothing more. No rank. No credentials. No explanation. I sat down and opened my notebook. Across the room, a tall officer glanced toward me before returning to his conversation. Major Daniel Ellis. I would learn his name later. At the time, he was simply another person wondering why I was there. The program director stepped onto the stage. Conversations faded. "Welcome to Leadership Assessment Week." The giant screen behind him illuminated with schedules, evaluations, and training objectives. For the next 7 days, participants would face decision-making exercises, strategic simulations, and leadership challenges designed to expose weaknesses under pressure. Most people looked excited. A few looked nervous. I looked interested. There is a difference. The director continued explaining procedures while I observed the room. Some participants leaned forward. Others checked notes. Several looked bored. Patterns appear quickly when you pay attention. During the first break, the comments became less subtle. "So what branch were you in?" one participant asked. I was not. His eyebrows rose immediately. "Really? Really?" He smiled politely before walking away. The reaction repeated itself several times throughout the morning. People asked questions. I gave short answers. The less information I provided, the more curious they became. By lunch, the room had already decided who I was. Or more accurately, who I was not. That was fine. Assumptions are easier to make than observations. Late that afternoon, the instructors introduced the first evaluation exercise. A complex planning scenario appeared across multiple screens. Teams immediately began debating solutions. Voices rose. Opinions collided. Confidence filled the room. I watched quietly, listened carefully, took notes. 20 minutes later, I noticed something nobody else seemed to see. A small detail buried inside a timeline. A mistake hiding behind a much larger problem. I wrote one sentence inside my notebook and closed it. Across the room, Major Ellis noticed. He glanced at me, then at the untouched planning materials on my table. His expression practically said the words out loud. "She has no idea what she is doing." I almost smiled. Because sometimes the most interesting moment in a story is not when people discover who you are. It is when they become absolutely certain that they already know. The first evaluation continued into the evening. Teams gathered around digital displays while instructors moved quietly between tables. The scenario looked complicated on the surface. Supply routes, communication delays, resource shortages. Most participants attacked every problem at once. That was their first mistake. I sat back and watched. The detail I had noticed earlier remained buried inside the timeline. Small, easy to miss, important. Across the room, voices grew louder. People defended ideas as if confidence alone could make them correct. Major Ellis stood near a screen explaining a solution to several officers. They listened carefully. He had presence, experience, the kind of authority that naturally attracts attention. Unfortunately, attention and accuracy are not always the same thing. 40 minutes into the exercise, the instructors announced an update. New information appeared across every screen. Several teams immediately abandoned their original plans. Others doubled down and argued harder. The room became increasingly chaotic. I reviewed the timeline again. The same inconsistency remained. The new information only made it more obvious. A captain sitting nearby noticed me studying the display. You have been looking at that same section for nearly an hour. I glanced over. Because that is where the problem is. She looked confused. The problem is everywhere. That is what they want you to think. She followed my gaze toward the timeline. You see something? Maybe. She smiled politely. The kind of smile people use when they assume you are mistaken. Good luck with that. Then she walked away. I returned to my notes. 20 minutes later, the teams presented preliminary recommendations. One by one, participants explained strategies, resource allocations, and response plans. Most presentations received approval from the room. Several even earned applause. Then Major Ellis presented his team's approach. It was polished, logical, detailed. The room responded positively. I understood why. It sounded impressive. There was only one problem. It depended on information that could not be trusted. When the presentation ended, the lead instructor looked around the room. Any alternative perspectives? Silence. Nobody volunteered. The instructor waited. Still nothing. Then, for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I raised my hand. The room immediately turned toward me. Major Ellis looked mildly surprised. Yes, Ms. Walker, the instructor asked. I stood. I think the recommendation is solving the wrong problem. The silence arrived instantly. Several participants exchanged looks. Someone near the back actually laughed. The instructor remained neutral. Explain. I pointed toward the timeline displayed on the screen. The resource shortages are not causing the communication failures. A few people frowned. The communication failures are causing the resource shortages. Nobody spoke. I continued. Every major disruption begins after the reporting network starts degrading. The shortages appear later. The room studied the display. Some people searched for evidence supporting my observation. Others searched for flaws. Major Ellis folded his arms. Even if that is true, it changes very little. I disagree. Why? I pointed toward another section of the timeline. Because every solution being proposed treats symptoms instead of causes. The room became quieter. The instructor stepped closer to the screen. For nearly 30 seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked back at me. Interesting. That single word changed the atmosphere. Not completely, but enough. Participants began reviewing the data again. Conversations restarted. Questions appeared. The certainty that had filled the room earlier suddenly felt less certain. Major Ellis continued studying the display long after everyone else resumed talking. Eventually, he looked in my direction. Not with skepticism. Not exactly. More like curiosity. It was the first time I had seen that expression on his face. The evaluation ended an hour later without revealing the correct answer. Participants packed their materials and headed toward the exits. Outside, snow drifted gently beneath the lights surrounding the facility. I walked toward my dormitory carrying the same notebook. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Walker. I turned around. Major Ellis stood several yards away. Yes. He hesitated for a moment. How did you notice that timeline issue? I looked toward the mountains beyond the facility. Then back at him. Because everybody else was looking where the noise was. His expression changed slightly. And you were not. No, he nodded once. Then he walked away. And for the first time since arriving at the program, I had the feeling that somebody was finally paying attention. The next morning began before sunrise. The mountains outside the facility were still wrapped in darkness when I stepped onto the observation deck with a cup of coffee. The air was cold enough to sting my face. Far below, small lights moved between buildings as staff prepared for another day of evaluations. Everything looked calm. It rarely stayed that way for long. By 7 o'clock, Hall Alpha was already buzzing with conversation. Word had spread faster than I expected. People were discussing the timeline issue from the previous exercise. Some agreed with my assessment. Others argued against it. A few seemed annoyed that a participant they barely knew had disrupted what everyone considered the obvious answer. Human nature is remarkably predictable. People often welcome new ideas, right up until those ideas challenge their own. The morning exercise focused on risk analysis. Participants received incomplete information and were asked to predict likely outcomes before additional data became available. Most people loved the challenge. They immediately began calculating probabilities and building complex models. I started by looking at what was missing. Absence often tells a better story than presence. Major Ellis approached my table before the exercise began. Mind if I ask you something? I looked up from my notebook. Depends on the question. He almost smiled. Do you always answer questions with questions? Not always. Good. He pulled out a chair. Because I am genuinely curious. That surprised me. 24 hours earlier, curiosity had been replaced by certainty. Go ahead, I said. He folded his arms. How do you approach a problem? The room around us grew louder as participants prepared for the exercise. I looked for assumptions. Everyone does that. No, I shook my head. Everyone says they do that. That earned a brief laugh. Fair point. Before he could continue, the instructor announced the start of the exercise. Screens illuminated across the room. Data appeared. Timers started counting down. The conversation ended. For now, the scenario involved a rapidly changing operational environment. New information arrived every few minutes. Most participants immediately adjusted their predictions with every update. That seemed reasonable. It was also creating a problem. They were reacting faster than they were thinking. 20 minutes into the exercise, I noticed something familiar. A pattern. Not in the information itself. In the timing of the information. Every update seemed designed to pull attention toward the newest development. The room followed obediently. Participants abandoned earlier conclusions and chased whatever appeared on the screen next. It reminded me of watching people run after every wave while ignoring the tide. I wrote a note in my notebook. Then another. Across the room, Captain Melissa Grant glanced toward me. She had been one of the people who dismissed my comments on the first day. Now she seemed less interested in dismissing and more interested in observing. The change was subtle, but it was there. 30 minutes later, the instructor paused the exercise. Time for predictions. Teams submitted their assessments. One by one, recommendations appeared on the central display. Most focused on the latest developments. Very few addressed long-term trends. When our turn arrived, I submitted a different conclusion. Not because I wanted to stand apart. Because the evidence pointed somewhere nobody was looking. Several participants immediately questioned it. That outcome is too unlikely. The numbers do not support it. There is no indication that would happen. I listened quietly. Then the instructor advanced the scenario. New information appeared. Conversations stopped. Another update followed. Then another. One by one, the assumptions supporting the most popular predictions began collapsing. The room grew noticeably quieter. Major Ellis stared at the screen. Captain Grant leaned forward in her chair. Nobody seemed interested in debating anymore. They were too busy watching the outcome unfold. The instructor finally turned toward the audience. Only one assessment accurately anticipated the shift. His eyes moved across the room before stopping in my direction. Nothing dramatic happened. No applause. No announcement. Just silence. But this silence felt different. It was not skepticism anymore. It was attention. And attention is where every real change begins. By the fourth day, nobody laughed when I entered Hall Alpha. That did not mean they trusted me. It only meant they were no longer comfortable dismissing me. There is a difference. The atmosphere had changed in subtle ways. Conversations paused when I walked past. People paid attention when I spoke. Even the instructors seemed more interested in my observations than before. Respect had not arrived yet. Curiosity had. And curiosity is often the first step. That morning, the program director announced a major event. Tomorrow's schedule has been moved forward. A large display appeared behind him. You will participate in the most difficult assessment of the week. The room immediately became quiet. Several participants exchanged looks. Others straightened in their seats. The director rarely used words like difficult. The exercise is known as the convergence scenario. Even the name sounded serious. Historically, fewer than 10% of participants achieve a successful outcome. That got everyone's attention. The director continued. You will receive incomplete information, conflicting objectives, changing conditions, and limited resources. Success depends on identifying what truly matters before time expires. I noticed Major Ellis glance toward me. Only for a second. Then he looked away. The briefing ended, but conversations continued throughout the day. People speculated about the upcoming challenge. They studied previous exercises, compared notes, reviewed strategies. Most were preparing for complexity. I suspected complexity was exactly what the scenario wanted them to focus on. The next morning arrived cold and clear. Snow covered the mountains beyond the facility. Hall Alpha looked different. Additional screens had been installed overnight. Large digital maps covered entire walls. Timers counted down from 90 minutes. Instructors stood along the perimeter observing quietly. The room felt less like a classroom and more like a command center. Begin, the lead instructor announced. Information flooded every display simultaneously. Supply disruptions, communication failures, weather complications, transportation delays, infrastructure problems, personnel shortages. New updates appeared every few seconds. The room exploded into activity. Participants rushed toward screens. Teams formed instantly. Voices rose. Plans emerged. Arguments followed. It was exactly what the designers intended. Too much information. Too many moving pieces. Too many distractions. I remained seated for nearly 3 minutes. Not because I was confused, because I was watching. Across the room, people chased data as fast as it appeared. Every update pulled their attention somewhere new. Major Ellis was already coordinating a group around one of the larger displays. Captain Grant was reviewing logistics projections. Everyone seemed busy. Very busy. I opened my notebook. Then I wrote 4 words. What is not changing? The question stayed in front of me while the room became increasingly chaotic. New alerts appeared. Teams adjusted plans. Fresh complications emerged. Yet beneath all the noise, something remained constant. A pattern. Small. Repeating. Hidden beneath the larger story. 30 minutes passed. Then 40. Participants looked increasingly frustrated. Every solution created new problems. Every adjustment generated additional complications. The scenario felt impossible because it had been designed to feel impossible. Major Ellis walked past my table. You have not joined a team. I noticed. He looked at my notebook. See anything interesting? Maybe. He almost smiled. That answer again. It keeps working. He shook his head and continued walking. 10 minutes later, I finally stood. I carried my notebook toward the central display and studied the timeline closely. The answer was there. Not obvious. Not dramatic. But there. Every major disruption traced back to the same origin point. Not the shortages. Not the weather. Not the transportation issues. Something deeper. Something everybody else was treating as a side effect. My pulse slowed. That always happened when pieces started fitting together. Around me, the room remained trapped inside complexity. But complexity is often just camouflage. And suddenly, for the second time that week, I became very certain that almost everyone was solving the wrong problem. The realization arrived quietly. No dramatic music. No sudden breakthrough. Just a simple observation hiding beneath 90 minutes of noise. I stood in front of the central display while updates continued flashing across the screens. Around me, participants chased new problems as fast as they appeared. Supply failures. Transportation delays. Resource conflicts. Every few seconds, another complication demanded attention. The scenario was winning because everyone was allowing it to define the battlefield. I opened my notebook and reviewed the timeline one final time. The pattern remained unchanged. Every major disruption followed the same sequence. Communication degradation appeared first. Everything else followed afterward. Not once. Every single time. Major Ellis approached the display carrying a stack of notes. You found something. It was not a question. I nodded. I think I found the actual problem. He looked at the screen. Everybody thinks they found the actual problem. That is the problem. He stared at me for several seconds. Then he followed my gaze toward the timeline. Show me. That surprised me more than I expected. For days earlier, he would have dismissed the idea immediately. Now he wanted evidence. Progress often arrives disguised as skepticism. I pointed toward the earliest entries. Look here. He studied the display. Communication failure. And here, another entry. Then another. Then another. His expression slowly changed. Those all happened before the shortages. Exactly. Before the transportation disruptions, too. Yes. He crossed his arms. That cannot be a coincidence. It is not. For the next few minutes, neither of us spoke. Around us, the room continued operating at full speed. Teams adjusted plans. Instructors observed quietly. Timers counted down. Yet suddenly the noise felt distant. Major Ellis finally exhaled. If this is right, then every recommendation in this room is wrong. I looked around Hall Alpha. Most of them. He shook his head slowly. People are treating symptoms. Because symptoms are easier to see. Before he could respond, Captain Melissa Grant joined us. What are you two looking at? Major Ellis pointed toward the timeline. Possibly the answer. She studied the screen. At first her expression showed confusion. Then concentration. Then surprise. Wait. I nodded. She saw it too. The network degradation starts everything. Yes. Then fixing resources first accomplishes nothing. Exactly. For the first time all week, 3 people stood on the same side of an argument before the room even knew an argument existed. The timer showed 22 minutes remaining. The lead instructor announced that final recommendations would be submitted in 15 minutes. Conversations intensified throughout the hall. Confidence returned. Teams polished strategies. Detailed plans filled digital displays. Entire walls became covered with projections and resource charts. The solutions looked impressive, complex, sophisticated. Wrong. Captain Grant glanced around the room. We should tell them. Major Ellis laughed quietly. Have you met these people? She smiled despite herself. Fair point. I looked back at the timeline. The exercise was designed this way. How? She asked. The answer is too simple. Major Ellis immediately understood. And people do not trust simple answers. Especially smart people. 15 minutes became 10. Then 8. Then 6. Teams submitted reports filled with charts, projections, and contingency plans. Entire presentations built around solving visible crises. Meanwhile, our recommendation occupied less than half a page. Restore communication integrity. Verify information pathways. Re-establish reliable reporting. Then address secondary effects. For steps. Nothing more. Captain Grant stared at our submission. This feels almost ridiculous. Maybe. Major Ellis leaned back in his chair. Or maybe it feels ridiculous because everybody else is making it complicated. 5 minutes remained. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Final revisions appeared everywhere. Last-minute changes. Emergency adjustments. People trying desperately to improve answers built on faulty assumptions. Then the timer reached 0. Every screen froze. Hall Alpha became silent. The lead instructor stepped onto the stage holding a tablet. His expression revealed nothing. Absolutely nothing. He looked across the room and waited until every conversation stopped. Then he smiled slightly. And in that moment, I had the strange feeling that the next few minutes were about to change far more than a training exercise. The silence inside Hall Alpha felt heavier than any conversation that had filled it earlier. Every participant watched the lead instructor standing at the front of the room with the evaluation results in his hands. Nobody checked a screen. Nobody reviewed notes. For the first time all day, the race to find answers was over. Now only the truth remained. The instructor looked around the room before speaking. Before we review team performance, I want to explain the purpose of this scenario. A large timeline appeared on the main display behind him. Colored markers highlighted critical events throughout the exercise. Most participants focused on visible crises. Several heads nodded. That was exactly what had happened. Resource shortages, transportation disruptions, operational delays. He paused. Those were not the primary problem. The room grew even quieter. The instructor advanced the slide. A new graphic appeared. Every major failure connected to a single source. Communication degradation. A red line stretched through the center of the timeline. This was the root cause. I heard someone exhale sharply a few rows away. Another participant lowered his head toward the table. Across the room, people were realizing the same thing at the same moment. The scenario had never been about managing chaos. It had been about identifying what created the chaos. The instructor continued. The exercise was designed to reward perception, not activity. That sentence landed harder than any score could. Around the room sat intelligent, experienced professionals who had spent 90 minutes working incredibly hard on the wrong problem. Then the final rankings appeared. Conversations immediately stopped. Team scores filled the screen. Assessment ratings. Performance summaries. Evaluation notes. Our recommendation ranked first. Not by a narrow margin. By enough to remove any doubt. Captain Grant stared at the display. Well, she said quietly. That answers that. Major Ellis looked from the screen toward me, then back toward the screen again. I still do not like how simple it was. I smiled slightly. Neither did the scenario designers. A few nearby participants laughed. The tension finally began to break. The instructor highlighted the winning submission. For steps. 1 root cause. Less than half a page. Compared to the lengthy reports submitted by other teams, it looked almost unfinished. The highest-rated recommendation focused on restoring communication integrity before addressing secondary effects, the instructor explained. Every other successful outcome depended on that decision. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of moving on immediately, the instructor looked directly toward our section. Who identified the pattern first? Several people turned in my direction. Captain Grant answered before I could. Rachel did. The room became very still. The instructor nodded once. Thank you. Nothing dramatic. No applause. No special recognition. Yet somehow the simple acknowledgement carried more weight than either. People were no longer asking whether I belonged in the program. That question had quietly disappeared. During the afternoon break, participants gathered throughout the facility discussing the results. For the first time, people approached me with genuine questions rather than assumptions. How did you spot it? What gave it away? When did you realize the answer? The conversations felt different. More respectful. More curious. Less certain. Major Ellis eventually found me standing near a window overlooking the mountains. Snow reflected bright sunlight across the distant peaks. You know what bothers me? He asked. Probably several things. He laughed. Fair. Then his expression became thoughtful. I keep replaying the exercise in my head. That is normal. The answer was there the whole time. Yes. He looked outside for a moment, and I never saw it. Neither did most people. He nodded slowly. You did. I considered that. Only because I was looking for a different question. He seemed ready to ask another one. Instead, an announcement echoed through the building. All participants were required to report to Hall Alpha the following morning for a special presentation. Attendance mandatory. Senior leadership expected. The message immediately attracted attention throughout the facility. Major Ellis raised an eyebrow. Senior leadership? Apparently. He folded the announcement sheet and slipped it into his pocket. Something tells me tomorrow is going to be interesting. I watched the mountains beyond the glass. For reasons I could not explain, I had the exact same feeling. The next morning, Hall Alpha filled earlier than usual. Nobody wanted to be late for a mandatory presentation involving senior leadership. Conversations drifted through the room in low voices while participants speculated about what was coming. Some expected a guest lecture. Others expected final evaluations. A few believed awards would be announced. I sat in my usual seat near the middle of the room and watched the snowfall outside the tall windows. The mountains looked distant and quiet beneath a gray sky. Inside, anticipation continued building. Major Ellis arrived carrying a notebook and coffee. Any predictions? He asked as he took his seat nearby. About today? Yes. I shrugged. Not enough information. He laughed. That might be the most frustrating answer you have ever given. Before I could respond, the room suddenly became quiet. The program director stepped onto the stage. Several instructors followed him. Unlike previous briefings, there were no training materials displayed behind them. No scenarios. No timelines. No evaluations. Just a single image showing the emblem of the Leadership Center. The director waited until every conversation stopped. Thank you for being here. His tone sounded different. More formal. This week has been designed to evaluate more than analytical ability. It has been designed to evaluate perception. Several people exchanged curious looks. The director continued. Many of the lessons learned here cannot be measured by scores alone. Then he stepped aside. A door near the stage opened. Every head in the room turned. A tall man entered wearing a dark jacket with no unnecessary insignia. He moved with calm confidence rather than authority on display. Some participants immediately recognized him. Others did not. I recognized him the moment I saw him. Commander Nathan Hayes, former operational leader, respected instructor, a name that carried weight far beyond this facility. Murmurs spread through the room. The director smiled slightly. Please welcome Commander Nathan Hayes. Polite applause followed. Nathan thanked the audience and approached the center of the stage. The room settled immediately. He did not begin with stories. He did not begin with credentials. Instead, he looked across the audience as though searching for something or someone. This week, he said, you were given problems designed to test decision-making under uncertainty. His voice was calm and measured. Most people believe leadership begins when answers become clear. He paused. In reality, leadership begins when answers are not clear at all. The room listened carefully. Nathan discussed observation, discipline, pattern recognition, the ability to separate signal from noise. Several participants took notes. Others simply watched. Then he said something unexpected. Over the years, I have worked alongside individuals whose greatest strength was not experience. It was perception. That word immediately caught my attention. Perception. The same word the program director had used minutes earlier. Nathan continued. The rarest professionals are not always the loudest. They are not always the highest ranking. Sometimes they are the people others overlook. The room became noticeably quieter. I saw Major Ellis glance toward me, then back toward the stage. Nathan slowly walked across the platform. One of the most valuable lessons any leader can learn is this. Never assume you understand someone's capabilities based on appearances. A few participants shifted in their seats. Others lowered their eyes toward notebooks. The statement landed exactly where it needed to. Nathan stopped speaking for several seconds. Then he smiled slightly, not at the room, toward a specific section of the room. My section. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Around me, nobody seemed to notice. Yet, Nathan folded his hands behind his back. In fact, he said, there is someone here today whose work I have followed for many years. The room immediately became alert. Curiosity spread across every row. Nathan looked directly toward me. And I suspect most of you have absolutely no idea who she really is. The silence that followed felt even louder than the applause had been. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire auditorium seemed suspended between one heartbeat and the next. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me at the same time. Some looked confused. Others looked curious. A few simply looked stunned. Major Ellis slowly leaned back in his chair. Captain Grant stared at me as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly changed shape. On stage, Commander Nathan Hayes remained calm. He allowed the silence to settle before continuing. Many years ago, he said, a small group of instructors began using a nickname whenever they discussed exceptional field observation and decision-making. He paused. The nickname was Iron Wolf. A ripple moved through the room. Not recognition. Curiosity. Most people had never heard the name before. Nathan continued. It was never about rank. It was never about publicity. It was a label attached to someone who consistently saw what others missed. My hands remained folded on the table. I had hoped this conversation would never happen in a room full of strangers. Yet somehow I knew it was too late to stop it. Nathan smiled faintly. Over the years, stories spread. Some became exaggerated. Some became inaccurate. But one detail never changed. He looked directly toward me. Whenever situations became confusing, that person had an unusual ability to identify the real problem before everyone else. The room remained completely silent. The large screens behind him illuminated the auditorium with a soft blue glow. Outside the windows, snow continued falling across the mountains. Nathan took a slow breath. Rachel Walker is that person. Nobody reacted immediately. The statement seemed to require several seconds to reach everyone at once. Then expressions began changing across the room. Surprise, disbelief, understanding, realization. Major Ellis lowered his eyes briefly before looking back toward me. Captain Grant simply shook her head and smiled. Nathan continued speaking. Some of you spent this week wondering why she approached problems differently. A few people laughed quietly. The answer is simple. She spent years training herself to notice what other people ignored. He walked slowly across the stage. That skill is rare. More importantly, it is difficult to teach. Several participants nodded. They understood now. Not everything, but enough. Nathan stopped near the center of the platform. What impressed me most this week was not her performance. That surprised me. He looked around the room. It was her restraint. The audience listened carefully. She never announced her experience. She never demanded credibility. She never corrected assumptions people made about her. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared throughout the auditorium. Nathan was being polite. Everyone understood what he meant. Instead, he continued. She allowed her work to speak for itself. The silence returned. This time it felt different. Warmer, respectful, thoughtful. The kind of silence that follows understanding. The program director stepped forward. One of the objectives of this course is to challenge perception. He glanced around the room. I would say that objective has been achieved. Soft laughter moved through the audience. The tension that had filled the room all week finally began disappearing. Yet the moment that stayed with me was not the reveal itself. It was what happened afterward. Nobody rushed toward me. Nobody treated me like a celebrity. Instead, people simply looked at me differently. Not because of a nickname. Not because of a reputation. Because they finally understood the reason behind the things they had witnessed all week. Nathan's gaze met mine briefly. There was no triumph in his expression. No performance, just quiet respect. The kind shared between professionals who value competence more than attention. As the presentation continued, I found myself looking around Hall Alpha one more time. The same room, the same people, the same mountains outside the windows. Yet somehow everything had changed. And for the first time since arriving at the facility, nobody in that room was trying to decide whether I belonged there. The presentation ended, but nobody rushed toward the exits. People remained in their seats for a few moments as if they were still processing everything they had heard. The room felt quieter than it had all week. Not because there was nothing left to say, because everyone was reconsidering things they had already said. Eventually, conversations began again. This time they sounded different, less certain, more thoughtful. The assumptions that had filled Hall Alpha on the first day had finally run out of places to hide. Participants slowly gathered their notebooks and materials. Some approached Captain Grant. Others spoke with instructors. A few glanced in my direction before continuing on. Nobody seemed quite sure how to start a conversation after realizing they had misunderstood someone for an entire week. I could not blame them. I gathered my notebook and stood. The same notebook I had carried into the facility on the first day. The same notebook that now felt strangely heavier. Not because it contained secrets, because it contained proof of how quickly perception can change. As I moved toward the exit, someone called my name. Major Ellis. I stopped and turned around. He approached with his hands in his pockets. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. I owe you an apology. I laughed softly. For what? Take your pick. That earned another smile. You never actually did anything wrong. No, he said, but I made plenty of assumptions. He looked toward the stage where the presentation had taken place. I kept thinking experience would look a certain way. Most people do. He nodded. That might be the problem. We stood there for a moment watching participants leave the room. Then he extended his hand. It was an honor learning from you this week. I shook it. Likewise. The exchange lasted only a few seconds. Yet it meant more than any score posted on a screen. Respect is valuable because it cannot be assigned. It has to be earned. Outside the facility, the afternoon sky had finally cleared. Sunlight reflected across fresh snow covering the mountains. The air felt crisp and clean. Groups of participants gathered near the walkways discussing lessons from the program. Some would remember the simulations. Others would remember the evaluations. Most would probably remember the reveal. I hoped they remembered something else. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing at a mountain overlook above the facility. The view stretched for miles in every direction. Snow-covered peaks, pine forests, endless sky. For the first time all week, there were no schedules to follow, no exercises to solve, no expectations waiting around the next corner. Just silence. Footsteps approached from behind. I already knew who it was. Commander Nathan Hayes stepped beside me and rested his arms against the railing. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The mountains handled that part of the conversation. Finally, he smiled. You handled that better than I expected. The presentation? Everything. I looked toward the horizon. You could have warned me. Probably. You did not. No, I laughed quietly. Fair enough. Nathan studied the landscape below. You know what impressed me most this week? What? You never tried to prove anything. I considered the question. People rarely change their minds because you tell them to. He nodded. True. They change their minds when they see something for themselves. The wind moved gently through the trees below us. Somewhere in the distance, sunlight broke through the clouds and illuminated an entire mountainside. Nathan followed the view for a moment before speaking again. That lesson is worth more than any evaluation score. Eventually, it was time to leave. Participants departed. Vehicles disappeared down mountain roads. Hall Alpha grew quiet again. Yet something remained behind. Not a reputation. Not a nickname. A reminder. Because the strongest voice in the room is not always the loudest one. Sometimes it belongs to the person everyone overlooked. And sometimes respect arrives the moment truth finally catches up.